some of one of the players that like was celebrating the Stanley Cup and jumped off of the roof into the pool. He slightly missed it, and he ended up denting the Stanley Cup and had to fix it, like on the edge of the pool.
That's
and,
amazing.
like, no one really knows that they haven't fixed the Stanley Cup.
Oh, that's sweet. All right, so now we'll begin chapter 9. So we're going to look at unemployment and inflation. We should be able to get through this in the next class and a half, and then we can hit the review the second half of Wednesday's class. So we'll start by looking at unemployment rate, like what some of these things are, what the unemployment rate is, labor force participation rate, things like that. Then we'll get into different types of unemployment. And then explain why we see unemployment. Then the second half of the chapter, we'll look at inflation. So we'll measure it, we'll use it to see how we adjust for the effects of changes in the price level, and then we'll compare like nominal and real rates. So, last chapter was all about total output, so we looked at GDP, and then a few like alternate measures, but mostly focused on GDP and real GDP. This time we're going to continue with these macroeconomic indicators, try to understand how well an economy is doing over time. So we'll use the unemployment rate to look at the labor market to see how people are able to get jobs, how many people don't have jobs that want jobs, and we'll look at inflation, so like how much people have to pay for goods and services. Did you just
get
up?
I just jumped over. Listen, I need bonus points.
Unemployment rate and inflation are commonly used concepts. These are stats that are talked about in the media when we talk about the economy. So understanding them is important as like a general citizen. And if this is a topic you're interested in, which I don't think there's no econ majors in here, so not really, but if there were, these are very important to the Federal Reserve and other national policymakers that are trying to set policy, I guess, for the country. Currently, the Federal Reserve is much more concerned about unemployment than they are inflation. Janet Yellen, who's the former Federal Reserve Chair, particularly focused on the unemployment rate. She did an interview about her career in economics over the summer, and she talked about when she first graduated with her PhD, one of the things she was really focused on and interested in was the unemployment rate. She was the president of the San Francisco Fed, and they focus exclusively on the unemployment rate when they do their research. They do a deep dive into that topic. So that was not surprising that was a focus of her term as chair. And the current Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, has basically continued the Fed's focus on the unemployment rate. The inflation rate was much more important back in the 70s and 80s when the inflation rate hit double digits. But now that it's been low and under 2% for so long, far less of a concern. And the unemployment rate typically has ramifications for politicians. So it's very difficult for a politician to win re-election when there's high unemployment in their district at the time. But strong employment in the lead up to their election really helps, no matter how poor their term was before that. We see an improving economy and people having jobs, having their incomes increase in the lead up to an election. They'll forgive 3 years of poor performance for 6, 8 months of good performance. So the key stat we're going to look at is the unemployment rate, but there are some other measures that help tell the whole story of how well the labor market's doing. What it'll do is it'll tell us the overall strength and the changes over time. So there's over 300 million people that live in the United States, and it would be pretty much impossible to report on their labor market activities regularly. So for GDP, we go in depth and we look at firms' records, we look at bank lending, we look at all these different things and get a measure of all of the transactions that are taking place. For the labor market, that would be super expensive, so they do surveys. So they take a representative sample of the population, survey them about what their employment situation is right now. So we're working here with estimates instead of working with actual numbers. So the labor force is the sum of the employed workers and unemployed workers in the economy. We'll dig in these unemployed and employed workers, those definitions a little bit more over the next couple slides. The one that's most watched of these labor force statistics, like I said, is the unemployment rate. So we're looking at the percentage of the labor force that's unemployed, that's actually looking for jobs. So each month, the Census Bureau conducts the Current Population Survey, the CPS. We also call the Household Survey. So we go to about 60,000 households in the United States that are selected to try to represent the entire makeup of the United States. When we look at the members of the household, we're counting those that are working age. So we consider that to be 16 years and older. Even though in some states, younger people can work. If it's like on a family farm or something, they can be like officially employed. We just look at 16 plus, because they're the ones that are most likely to have a job. So if we're trying to understand how well the labor market is doing, we're going to look at people that are most likely to work, not people that tend to not work in the labor market. And on this survey, they're asked about their employment situation during what they call the reference week. So they'll say like, 3 weeks ago, did you work? How many hours did you work? If you didn't work, were you looking for a job? Ask all these sorts of questions to understand basically what's going on in their employment life at the time. Yeah, like I said, they're asking about recent job search activities if they are unemployed. So have you been looking for a job? How many jobs have you been looking for? I think they get into like, have you like interviewed for the job, like how deep into the process you got to try to understand what's going on. So we mainly classify employees or workers into 3 main categories. The first is employed. So they're working at least 1 hour in that reference week, or they're temporarily away from their job. So if they're out of work for like being sick, they're on vacation, they're on strike, they're still counted as employed, even if they weren't working in that particular week. Then we consider people unemployed. So these are someone who's not currently working, who does not currently have a job, but is available for work and is actively looking for work in the previous month. So if you're actually like applying to jobs, going in, filling out forms, whatever, like you're considered unemployed. If you don't have a job and you're not actively searching for a job and trying to get a job, you're considered not in the labor force. A lot of people, I think like a little over 30% of the US economy, or US working age population is not in the labor force. And we'll get into the various reasons why they're not in the labor force. One of them is discouraged workers. So discouraged workers are people who are available for work. They could work, but they're not looking for a job in the previous 4 weeks because they don't think there's any jobs available for them to get. So because they've gone so long without finding a job, or maybe they don't have skills that match up to the current jobs that are available, they're not out there looking for jobs right now. So we break down, this is a figure that shows all the different categories. On the left side, total we have on top, we have the working age population, so the entire over 16 population in the US, which we then break up into the labor force. It's kind of hard to see with these colors. Labor force here, and not in the labor force here. So they have the employed and the unemployed, as we talked about. And then we have those not in the labor force. So we break down the different types. So there's some that are just not available for work in general. So people that choose to work as housemakers, to stay with their, like take care of the family, retirees who no longer work, full-time students, people like that are also considered not in the labor force. I don't want to jump into those now if we're going to talk about them later, but okay. Now let's look at just the labor force itself. So it's based on the current population survey estimates. We can look at several different indicators. First one is the unemployment rate, the most common one. So it's the number of unemployed divided by the labor force, multiplied by 100 so you get that percentage. So in August 2015, it was 8.03 million that were unemployed, and the entire labor force was 157 million. So you just divide the unemployed by the total labor force, multiply by 100 to get the percentage. We have 5.1% unemployment rate. Again, the total economy is much larger than that. Or the total working age population was 251 million. So we're not counting people that aren't actively looking for jobs in the unemployment rate. We're calculating the unemployment rate. It's just those that do not have jobs that want jobs and are actively searching for those jobs. The formal name for this is the U3 series. So there's 6 different levels of the unemployment rate that calculate, or that include a larger and larger group of people in the labor force, so in the denominator. Another important indicator is the labor force participation rate. So this is just the percentage of the working age population that's in the labor force. If we take the whole working age population, so back August 2015, that was 251 million. That's your denominator. And then the numerator is just the labor force itself. So this year it was 157 million. So this year 62%, 62.6% were considered in the labor force. They were either employed or they were unemployed and actively looking for work. And the last major one is the employment to population ratio. So the percentage of the working age population that is employed. So back in August 2015, it was 59.3%, so almost 60% of the working age population had a job. Now this might seem low, but remember this includes full-time students that aren't working. This includes retirees. This includes people that stay at home and take care of their family. So there are problems with the unemployment rate. Again, with any of these aggregate statistics, we're going to have issues. And especially because in this case, we're doing estimates. We're not actually calculating or tabulating all the different people in the economy that are employed or unemployed. So it may understate the unemployment rate. And the reason it would do that is distinguishing between people who are unemployed and those that are not in the labor force requires some judgment. So do we exclude discouraged workers or not? How many weeks should the limit be for the cutoff for people looking for jobs? Should it be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks? Before we cut them off from being unemployed to just not in the labor force. There's judgment calls there, and that's why they have the different levels of unemployment. It only measures employment, not the intensity of employment. So if you want to work full-time, you want to have a full-time job, but you can't find one because of the economy, because of some situation that's going on, but you can find a part-time job, you're able to work a part-time job, so you accept it. In that case, you're underemployed. You're working fewer hours, you don't have as good of a job as you want, but you are not actually counted as unemployed. So there's no way for us to tell from the unemployment rate that you want to be working more. It also might overstate unemployment. So people can lie and claim that they're looking for work. Oh no. Anyone here watch Seinfeld? Anyone here's parents watch Seinfeld? There's a clip in one episode. You know what? I'll pull it up. I was going to include this. Has been unemployed for like 2 seasons.
Asking for Vanderlei Industries. No, what happened to you? All right, listen close. I was at the unemployment office, and I told them I was very close to getting a job with Vanderlei Industries, and I gave them your phone number. So now, when the phone rings, you have to answer, Vanderlei Industries.
I'm Vanderlei Industries?
Right.
What is that?
You're in latex. Latex. Right.
What do I do with latex?
I don't know, you manufacture it.
Right here in this little apartment?
And what do I say about you?
You're considering hiring me for your latex salesman.
I'm gonna hire you as my latex salesman?
Right.
I don't think so. Why would I do that?
Because I asked you to.
If you think I'm looking for someone to just sit at a desk, pushing papers around, you can forget it. No headache just trying to manufacture this stuff. Dandelion Industries. Kel Varnson speaking. May we help you?
Hey, what are you doing Friday night?
Friday night? Nothing. Now.
You want to come with me and see the baby?
Now, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to see the baby.
Come on, if you don't see the baby now, you're never going to see her.
All right, all right.
Yellow. What delay industries? Now you're way off. Well, yeah, that's the right number, but this is an apartment. What? Yeah, no problem. How did you know who they wanted?
And you want to be my latex salesman?
So what we get sometimes is the George Costanzas of the world lying on these surveys and saying that they're actively looking for work when they're not. That was his whole scheme there, was to create that fake company just so it looked like he was working or looking for work. Oftentimes, different forms of unemployment insurance or other government assistance is tied to looking for work, actively looking for work. So people will claim they are when they're really not, making the statistics a little muddled. Some of the cause of the prolonged employment or the high unemployment rate after the recession in 2008 was the extension of unemployment benefits to like double what they normally are. In order to receive those, you had to be looking for a job. So it took people that typically would just leave the labor force and not be counted in the unemployment rate that stayed as being counted in the labor force. So it made the unemployment rate artificially high. And the San Francisco Fed, they estimated about 1 percentage point of the unemployment rate that lingered after the recession was due to the extension of those unemployment benefits. So you don't have anything changing underlying the economy in the situation. You just have people saying they're looking for work or actually looking for work when they typically would leave, changing what the unemployment rate is. So it's another way that it makes it difficult to accurately estimate what's really going on in the labor market. There's obviously people that work in the black market that claim not to be working to evade taxes, keep their criminal activity unnoticed. So again, you can't quite capture everything with this unemployment rate as currently measured. So some people think we should include discouraged workers. We should include underemployed workers in the official unemployment statistics. They think that the official U3 rate that we talk about is too restrictive. So there's other measures of unemployment. The most broad measure is called U6. This includes discouraged workers as part of the denominator term, and it includes underemployed workers as unemployed workers. So we have this broader measure of unemployment. Here the U3 is the red line, and the U6, this broader measure, is the blue line. So we see when the unemployment rate was about 10% during the 2008-2009 recession, the U6 rate was up almost 18%. So it was much higher when we count people that are forced to work part-time jobs and they want to work a full-time job, or people that leave the labor market because they can't find a job. Turning to the labor force participation rate over time, looking at this since 1948, you see the labor force participation rate of adult men has slowly declined. Haven't really seen any change in any events, just a slow decline since 1948. Same time, we see it significantly increasing for women until about 2000, at which point it levels off and starts to dip again. So labor force participation rate overall has increased from 1948, due entirely to greater entrance of women into the labor force. But we've seen these trends reversing for the past 20 years, or the trends for females reversing for the past 20 years, and decreasing like labor force participation rate for men. We look back at the 2007-2008 recession. The unemployment rate has not returned, or had not returned to normal until very recently. And then, with COVID, that ruined all our statistics. But even after the unemployment rate finally returned to normal, the employment to population ratio still didn't. It remained subdued compared to before the recession. So some of these reasons are an aging population. More and more baby boomers are retiring, so they're considered not in the labor force. So that's going to reduce this employment to population ratio. Not because the economy is doing any worse, nothing else structurally is going on, just a bunch of old people are retiring, which is normal. But because of these demographic changes, it looks as if something else is going on. But the employment population ratio for all workers fell from 63.4% to 60.2% after the recession. So that's 8 million fewer workers. So it's not just baby boomers that's causing this. For prime age workers, so workers 25 to 54, we still saw the employment to population ratio drop by 1.7%, or percentage points. So it's smaller than the overall, but there's still something going on with younger people as well. Again, not just boomers. So the first, they don't have all the things here listed in the textbook. One of them is labor market scarring. People lost their job during the Great Recession, and it took them a while to find another job. They're unemployed for a long time. The longer it takes to find a job, the more you have these skills deteriorate that you need for those specific industries. When we get this deterioration of industry-specific skills, it then becomes harder and harder to get a job in the future. So if you're out of work for a couple weeks, not too difficult to find a new job. You're still fresh. But if you're out 2-3 years, say you're an accountant and you're out 2-3 years, you've been doing no accounting, it'll be that much more difficult to jump back in. And maybe they upgraded to a new system, or like a new software package, or I don't know, there's new Excel stuff to do. Because you've been out of work for so long, you're out of practice, you'll be that much less productive as a worker. So it becomes more difficult to find a job. And firms are more reluctant to hire someone who's been out for a while. After the recession, we saw the unemployment, or the duration of unemployment increase substantially compared to periods before the financial crisis. So even in past recessions, people weren't out of work for as long as they were during the previous recession. So this was a serious problem of workers being out for a while and being more difficult to get back into work. So they ended up being some of the last people hired during the recovery. Another problem is more people on Social Security disability insurance. So half of prime age men that are not in the labor force are on SSDI. Quite a few of them are on pain medication, of these people that are on SSDI, and say that they can't work because of the pain. That these physical injuries are making it possible for them to work. So having this Social Security disability insurance allows them to still have health insurance without working. So we expect it's now easier to get health insurance without working, so we expect fewer people on the edge there that are in serious pain, fewer of them to suck it up and work and deal with that pain when they can get health insurance without that. And that's not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Some of these people, it's probably a good thing that they're not being forced to work and be in pain 40 hours a week. But we're seeing this decrease the employment to population ratio. Another big one is the Affordable Care Act. Just like the SSDI, one of the same causes here is the fact that we've tied health insurance to employment, unlike other countries and unlike the US in the past, and unlike other types of insurance. Anyone know why you get your health insurance through your employer, but not like car insurance or house insurance or anything like that? All the way back in World War II, we put wage controls on a lot of industries to keep costs down because so many people were over fighting in the war. You needed higher wages to try to, I don't know, pull people from one company to another, or to entice people to like enter the labor force. So what they did was they enacted wage controls to try to prevent that, to keep the costs down, producing all these munitions for war. But firms are still trying to recruit workers when there's a shortage of workers. So what they do is they offered all these different perks, and one of them being health insurance. It was only a small portion of workers that got it, but it was still something. And then right after World War II, there was not a tax loophole, but income taxes were designed that you didn't have to pay income taxes on health insurance you like received from your employer. So slowly over time, more and more people got health insurance offered by their employers. So fast forward to today, and basically everyone who gets a job gets health insurance from their employer. So we've tied getting his health insurance to a job. So now, until the Affordable Care Act, most people had to work a job if they wanted to get health insurance, if they wanted to be able to like afford health insurance. So when you make it easier to get health insurance outside of employment, we'd expect fewer people to work. And that's what the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, nerds in DC that tell the legislator like what the effect of the legislation actually is, found that there was a decline in employment associated with the Affordable Care Act, which is what we generally expect. Now there's minimum wage. Minimum wage makes it more difficult for low-skilled workers to initially break into the labor market. Only like 1.9% of workers actually make the minimum wage, so it's a very small group of people. And like, something about 90% of them aren't the main income earner in their household. So it's typically not like the heads of households that are relying on minimum wage. It's the secondary, third or fourth like worker in the family that makes minimum wage. So it's more of an entry level thing. So because there's this extra barrier to getting in, we see slightly less employment. And it's not a huge effect, but it is adding to this this reduction in people working. Now there's licensing requirements. So some of these are very like small scale, like minimum wage. Some of these are passed like, within cities that have their own minimum wage. Seeing next is occupational licensing, which is passed at the state level. Licensing makes it more difficult to enter these occupations. You end up with about 14 fewer professionals in licensed occupations and similar unlicensed occupations. So you're making it more difficult for people to get into these jobs. And it's not only just for like physicians and for lawyers and dentists and like healthcare in general. The Institute for Justice says there are found 102 low-skilled occupations that don't require a college degree, that require some sort of occupational licensing. These barriers to entry just make it more difficult, especially for low-skilled workers, to break into the labor market. The last one is better video games. It might sound like a joke. Mark, I don't want to say his last name, Aguiar from Princeton, focuses on video games a lot. Basically, there's a higher opportunity cost of working because leisure is so much better than it used to be in the past. 40 years ago, when your parents were like, young, their leisure options weren't very good. There's you probably heard them bitch to you guys. There's like 6 TV channels. Maybe if they were super into video games, they had Pong. Didn't have a lot of options for fun. Now video games are awesome. There's tons of TV and like streaming options. So there's a lot more we can do just sitting at home. So there's that much more to do without working. So fewer people are going to end up working. Young men, so those aged 21 to 30, work 12% fewer hours now than in the year 2000, which is the largest drop for any age group. These are the people you expect to, leave the labor market or to work part-time instead of full-time, live in their mom's basement and just play video games for the day. So there's a lot of different things that are causing this reduction in employment to population ratio. And a lot of these are little micro things or things that policymakers can't really affect. And we have different, the variations unemployment rate by ethnic group. And we break it down by education level as well. So we see minorities tend to have lower or higher unemployment rates, lower levels of employment. Asians have the lowest unemployment rate. And then going to education. High school dropouts tend to have the lowest, or the highest unemployment rate, High school graduates have a fairly high unemployment rate. College graduates have a much lower unemployment rate. So you see it vary by worker characteristics. Okay, like I mentioned, long periods of unemployment are bad for workers because their skills end up deteriorating. This is they risk becoming discouraged and depressed. They did a study in Germany over the psychology of people that are unemployed. In Germany, once you reach a certain age, probably like 60 because it's lower than the US, if you're unemployed, you officially get characterized as retired and you start receiving a retirement benefit instead of an unemployment benefit. What they saw is once people reached that age, the rates of depression dropped considerably. Instead of being unemployed and being like, oh, I can't find a job, suddenly they're just a retired person. And which was, I guess, much better for them psychologically. You don't have the difficulty of telling people you're unemployed, the difficulty of looking for jobs and being rejected. So it does have this human effect that actually psychologically harms people from being unemployed when they want to be employed. You have something you're going to say?
Yeah. So what are kids who go to the military considered? Are they employed or?
They're not employed. I think they fall under not currently looking for work because of childcare, transportation, other reasons. There is one measure, I forget which one of the measures, that does count military. But military is so weird that they just remove it because they, usually for these they say the official name has civilian in front of it, just to show that it's not someone in the military. Because you get weird things one of my friends, when COVID started, got sent home. They said, we'll give you your new assignment soon. And he just found out his new assignment 2 weeks ago. So even though he's been being paid by the military, he wasn't working for the military. So how would you classify that? Right? It's just a weird situation. So they just, I guess, keep it simple by just not even counting military, which makes it difficult because the number of people in the military changes over time. We end up with another little inaccuracy from trying to estimate this unemployment rate. So since World War II, the average length of unemployment has been relatively low. Haven't seen people get stuck out of work for a long time. As technology improved, we saw even lower lengths of unemployment because it makes it that much easier to find a new job. For us, if you want to find a job, you go online, you can apply to 100 in a day. That'd be a long, shitty day, but you could apply to 100 in a day. In the past, you had to fill out paper resumes, actually go in person to get them or to turn them in. And it was much more difficult to find out about these jobs. So we have this much more efficient matching of unemployed people to open jobs. But in the aftermath of the recession for about 5-6 years, we still had elevated long-term unemployment rates. So we saw it increase again after the recession because of some of the changing industries that we saw. Some industries die or permanently be reduced because of the recession. We talked about some of the problems with actually surveying people. So another thing the BLS does is use what they call the establishment survey. So they go to businesses and ask them about their employment. Now, there's also some disadvantages to this. Self-employed people aren't being surveyed, so we're missing out on a huge chunk of employers and employees. You don't get newly opened firms in there, so again, you're missing some types of firms. And you only get information on employment. You can't get unemployment from this, because you're not talking to the workers that aren't being employed. And you also need large revisions sometimes because of the establishments that end up being included, whether they're a representative sample or not. But the big advantage of this is the data is determined by real payrolls. So you actually know these workers are actually working, instead of people just claiming whether they're working or not, whether they're looking for jobs or not. So you get a much more accurate picture. But you're missing some of these other things. So to compare the two, back in August 2015 and July of 2015, if we look at the household survey, 148 million and change said they were working. In August, 149 and change said they were working. So we had to change an increase in about 200,000. The establishment survey, we had 142 and change in July. So we have 6 million fewer workers looking at this other survey. And then in August, the establishment survey said there are 142 and change working. So we had, like 175,000 increase. So we had a smaller increase, depending on which survey you looked at. Yeah, like it says there, we don't expect the numbers to be identical between the two surveys, even if there's 100% honesty on both sides, like for both of those, because we're looking at different groups. Because we're not including those small firms or the new firms, or like self-employed people, in the establishment survey. And because we're including all of those in the household survey. And if we look at both of those, we can get a complete picture. And we can see that even though the numbers themselves are different, the change is pretty much the same. Another important problem to remember with these is that policymakers need to rely on these economic indicators in like real time, so they try to get them out as quickly as possible. So what they do is they provide estimates of employment and unemployment for the previous months as quickly as possible. And then they go through the data more in depth later, and they provide revisions. Like we talked about with GDP in the previous chapter, same thing for employment. And same thing for inflation as well. Usually it's pretty accurate, but here we see during the recession, huge overestimations in the employment rate. So in 1 month in 2008, there were 300,000 more people that were unemployed, that were losing their jobs at the time, than was being reported in the unemployment rate. So policymakers were consistently overestimating how good the labor market was at this time. You see this for basically a year, they were working with bad data. And it's really weird to look at the minutes of the Federal Reserve meetings now, when the financial crisis was happening, when things were collapsing, and they're saying, well, unemployment isn't too bad, but we're kind of worried about inflation. It's still running a little high. It turns out they overestimated the inflation rate, and they underestimated the unemployment rate. So they came back later and had these huge negative revisions. So an unemployment rate at the time was, I don't know, maybe it looked like it was 5%. It was really like 6, 7%. So they ended up getting a poor picture of what was actually going on. Now, Friedrich Hayek famously critiqued the use of aggregate statistics. He didn't like measures like GDP, unemployment, inflation, and he pointed out a lot of the problems with them. One of them was that when you use aggregate numbers, you're looking at the entire economy, you're missing out on all these little changes that are going on. You don't see jobs being added, jobs being lost, where these jobs are occurring, what industries are doing better, what industries are doing worse. You can just see the overall health of the labor market, which can be helpful, but hides so much. And he thought the most interesting stuff and the stuff that economists should focus on is these dynamic changes that are happening. Even Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair, noted this problem, and she used a wide array of labor market indicators. She used like 8 or 10. Something it doesn't show, the headline unemployment rate, is all the jobs being created and destroyed. So in 2014, there were about 29 million jobs created, 26 million that are being lost. So we have a ton of new jobs and a ton of jobs that are going by the wayside. So we've got these new firms, new industries, these firms that are expanding, and then we have firms that are failing or cutting back employment. So there's a lot of churn going on in the economy. As new products are being created, new businesses are being formed, old industries are dying. And it's going to be a natural process for the economy, but it's not something we get to see looking at the headline unemployment numbers. So we end up seeing the net changes. We don't see how dynamic the labor market really is. All these changes that are constantly happening. Okay, let's start looking at the types of unemployment. There's 3 main ones we're going to focus on. There's frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and cyclical. So here's the unemployment rate from 1950 to 2014. This number here at the bottom is 2%. It's not even 0. We see unemployment rate never goes that low, not even to 2%. So there's always some unemployment that's naturally going to be there in the economy, no matter how well it's doing. And we've had some really good economic performance in some of these years, but there's always some present. Now, why this is the case is because of the different types of unemployment. Some of them are always going to be there. So if we break these down, unemployment by the type of unemployment, we can understand why this is the case. So the first is frictional. Frictional unemployment is short-term unemployment. So people that aren't out of work for very long because of the natural time it takes to find a new job. Employers don't hire someone immediately. Employees don't immediately get that job, immediately find that opening that they want. So because of this job search, there's going to be just some time that it takes. Frictional unemployment is much shorter now, the time frame, because of how much easier it is to find jobs. But even now, there's still some time it's going to take to get this new one. Hiring is still a fairly long process. The interview process to make sure that the employee fits the position, and for the employee to find a job that meets, the skills that they actually have to offer. Another reason for this frictional unemployment is seasonal unemployment. So throughout the year, some jobs are more in demand and less in demand. So like ski instructor, obviously more in the winter in demand than in the summer. You're going to hire more lifeguards in the summer instead of the winter. Farm work is going to focus around harvesting time. Retail workers tend to have higher employment. There's a lot more demand for them around Christmas than there is throughout the rest of the year. So what the BLS does because of this is they release the raw data that includes all the different seasonal variation in employment. And also they have seasonally adjusted employment figures. So they'll take into account the changes of demand in different industries, different times in the year. And it's not that those people that lose their jobs because of the seasonal changes in demand doesn't matter. It's just that there's nothing that policymakers can do about it. So rather than including that and having this noise in there, they try to remove it to see the underlying trends, not, unemployment that's caused by temperature or the calendar. So like the Federal Reserve can do nothing to smooth out retail demand after Christmas. So they're not going to focus on that. They're going to focus on the underlying unemployment, which you actually have the tools to help change. And some frictional unemployment is good. It increases economic efficiency over time because it allows for better job matches. Because you have these employers that are looking for employees that actually have the skills they need, you end up with better performing employees. You end up with people with jobs they like more, and people end up being better at those jobs. All right, next is structural unemployment. So this is unemployment that results because there's a mismatch between the employees themselves, the skills that they have, and the job requirements and what jobs are actually out there. So structural unemployment is associated with longer unemployment spells. So, I mean, the stereotypical thing we think of now is like the coal miner or the steel mill worker. The mill closes or the mine closes, and they only have the skills to work in those industries. Now, there's a lot of demand for healthcare workers, but they don't have the skills to work in healthcare. They don't have the education or the training. So they're going to suffer structural unemployment. And odds are they'll be out of work for a much longer period of time. The textbook gives an example of like animators for cartoons. They used to use like freehand drawing do cartoons, and now they just use like 3D computer imaging. So when they switched over to using computers for that, a lot of the animators that would draw freehand lost their jobs because they didn't have the proper skills. And until they either exited and went to a new industry or learned those computer skills, they were out of work because of structural unemployment. So if you have a structurally unemployed worker, odds are they're going to need some form of retraining or training to get into a new industry so that they can obtain a job in the modern economy. In these new industries that are expanding rather than the contracting older industries. All right, we'll stop here for the day. Next time we'll pick up with the cyclical unemployment rate